Good morning. My name is Jean Catherine, and this is the second video for my patrons on my patron page. So thank you for being a patron. I really appreciate it. So there are a few things I want to talk about today, and I'll do my best to do them in some kind of linear fashion. The first thing is that one of the questions I get most often from people who are interested in neuroscience and have a three principles understanding or background is the question, well, how does this work? Like, if there's this thing called neuroscience, and if our brains work a certain way, then isn't that outside in? Aren't our brains doing something to us? And, I think there are a couple misunderstandings within that question. And the first misunderstanding has to do with, what is the three principles? What is this experience at work in our lives? And so any of you who are unfamiliar with three principles, here would be a brief description of that. Because fundamentally, Sydney Banks, who founded the Three Principles Understanding, who had a direct enlightenment experience, shared that we are a creation coming from a spiritual source. Everything is. So your fence outside is, the color you paint your fence is, your heart beating inside your chest is, your brain is, your skin is, the relationships you have in your life are. Everything that is happening in your life is coming from fundamentally a creative source, and it's coming from an energetic spiritual source. Now, not all neuroscientists believe that, but some neuroscientists do. Some neuroscientists believe that there is a source of energy that is creative and potential, and that enlivens the physical body and the form within which we live. And so Banks called that mind. He said that's universal mind. And so we have this incredible capacity, this learning capacity, this creative force that's coming through us all the time, that's creating everything all around us. And then Banks said, the best way to talk about that is to talk about it and break it down into three principles. It's not really that there are three principles, because fundamentally, that creative source is the same, no matter how you talk about it. So you might call it God, or you might call it, you might come from different religions and have different words and different names and different ways of forming and talking about this creative source. But at least in this conversation about the human psychological experience, fundamentally, all of those different forms and way of talking are born of this capacity we have as human beings for creation. And so Sid talked about this very simply. He said there's this principle of mind, that we have this creative energy, this spiritual source, that it's a shared spiritual source, that it enlivens our world, that it brings to life what is being created. And then the second one is fundamentally that we as human beings, and if you watch the world, actually, even plants are aware, right? So plants will move with the sun, or if you play different music, plants will react and respond to music differently. There's plenty of research on that. Feel free to check it out. So consciousness is what we describe, that ability to be aware, awake, knowing, right? Something is happening, to be to distinguish ourselves from other spiritual forces, right? So my genius is genius because of consciousness, because it comes alive through consciousness, and it's connected to a fundamentally conscious source, a spiritual source that's showing the light on everything and waking us up to the life and to the living that we have. And then the final principle is the principle of thought. And that's the one we spend a lot of time talking about. And we spend a lot of time talking about it if we're psychologists. We spend a lot of time talking about it if we are coaches. We spend a lot of time talking about it if we are philosophers, right? We tend to play in thought. And what Banks said is so important about the principle of thought is that fundamentally, we've misunderstood our thinking, the things, our personal thinking, the outside in thinking, the the kind of thinking we have that gets very busy in rumination, and sort of we've misunderstood that thinking to be this living energy and source, this creative force, as something real. Because of this creative force coming through, this little thinking becomes real to us. But Sid said, fundamentally, what's interesting about that isn't the little thinking. It's not the content of your thinking. It's not that, you feel frustrated now, or you feel angry right now, or somebody said something to you didn't like, or your house is moving, or you're getting a divorce, or the content of your thinking isn't actually what's powerful. What's powerful is that you experience life through this power of thought. So we distinguish it in the Three Principles community. We distinguish thought and thinking. Thought is sort of big T. It's this powerful force that paints the experience that we're having. And the little t is every little thing that you think, the words that you think and the images you think and the sensations you have. Anytime you focus onto your feelings, your sensations, your little thoughts, it's like all of that is the content of this power that is incredibly powerful, so that when we think it, when we feel it, when we sense it, we have an experience. Now, the reason I think that's an important conversation to go into the neuroscience conversation with is because fundamentally, as neuroscientists, we don't know where that energy source that enlivens the brain originates from. Because when you're looking in the physical form, you cannot trace back to the spiritual form. Now, there's all kinds of really interesting stuff going on in quantum physics right now, where they are demonstrating that there is a whole set of laws that exist that do not operate in the same way that our physical laws operate in. But they trump our physical world. So in other words, we live in a physical world, but larger than that world is this quantum world. And quantum physics and quantum science investigation is revealing that there's a whole nother set of rules in that world that are totally different, even sometimes diametrically opposed to the way we think about the rules of our physical world. And so an example of that would be, an electron jumping in and out of substance. So you have a particle that is sometimes solid and it's sometimes a wave. And so in quantum physics, that's true. You could have something that is one thing one moment and changes into something in another moment. But in the physical world, we only see that kind of change with like water, right? And we know how that works, and we're able to observe it, and it happens over time. And it's so it's an interesting thing, because in our physical world, this is form. It's not a wave. My hands aren't going to change, and yet they're designed from this world that is never permanent, that is always shifting and changing and creating. And so that's an important piece of information for neuroscientists, because neuroscientists can begin to just think about the brain and the mechanics of the brain. And they don't think about the larger source that is the umbrella to that experience. So I want to point out to you as we go forward that your brain is just like the fence that I talked about earlier outside. Okay, you can take the fence down. You can and it won't be there anymore, right? So you take your brain out and you won't have it anymore, and it won't function anymore, just like a fence wouldn't function anymore. And or you can paint the fence, right? You can reshape the fence. You can put different things on the fence and decorate the fence, right? So we can do that with our brains. We can adapt and shift and play with our brains because they are form and they live in a system of natural law and mechanics and techniques, and that's all true. But that whole system is enlivened by a spiritual source, which is the source of all things. And that's the duality that we struggle with as human beings, seeing beyond our so impactful and noticeable physical form to see ourselves as part of a source that's much larger than this individual form, that lives beyond this individual form, and that enlivens creation and everything that we do. So that's the big picture. And then the little pieces I wanted to cover about our brain, which is much smaller than that. I wanted to paint a picture for you about your synapses and the way that your brain is communicating, because I think there's an old image we have in traditionally, the way the brain was talked about was it was imagined it was much like a muscle. So if you imagine your muscle, let's say your bicep muscle, it has an origin, it has an insertion, and one pulls the other, right? So one stays still and the other pulls, and it creates this motion. And muscles are relatively the same. So they attach in different places on different people, but they're around the same area. So we have a general approximation of what that looks like. And then you could say that we're true for a lot of physical things. We can document and show sort of what the left hand does or what the right hand does. There's an enormous variation in the world. So no human beings are exactly the same. But because our minds like to categorize, and because we love to put things into boxes and make sense of them, we are able to do that with our physical body. And we imagined that our brains would be much like that. They would be like filing cabinets that you could open and close, and you could press buttons and then things would happen. And that's the ultimate like cause and effect mechanism relationship. But what we're discovering over the last 30 years is that, in fact, the brain is much more like an ocean or like the stars, right? There's more neurosynapses in your brain than there are stars in the sky. So that's kind of really mind-boggling to me, that your brain is like a whole universe, which is amazing. And then also what we're discovering is that it doesn't work, like it's not really that one area controls this. So you hear that a lot. It's like, this is located in your blah, 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 your executive, whatever, your ganglia, your, all kinds of different terminology. But really your brain works as like, if you imagine the ocean, how the waves are affected by each other. One little thing starts over here and then it creates this big wave over there. And everything is connected. So you have this ocean of potential. And there's this network happening where one area becomes enlivened and it enlivens another area, which enlivens another area, and they work as a network. So you would think that all these networks are then these must be the same, right? But in actuality, people develop different networks. And so you may have one person who developed a language ability in one area, who then is able to replace that with a whole nother language. Or you have somebody who ends up using the same language area and both languages become enmeshed, right? Or you have, I think a better example of this would actually be people with Parkinson's who are learning how to walk again, but they're using different parts of their brain in order to make that habitual, and so they don't have to depend on the parts that they've lost, on the neural networks they've lost. And so we always have this capacity to find new neural networks. And there's a great book out now called, maybe it's been out, it's called Habits, and it may have a longer name than that. I'll have to post it. But one of the things I enjoyed about that book is written by a journalist, and so he made it very accessible. And he talks about how we have this capacity as human beings to build habits, and that the old habits never go away, which I think is fascinating. So you have an area of your brain that has become real estate you don't use, but it's never completely gone. It just becomes this out of date. And then you have this other area that develops that takes over that pattern. So for example, I used to eat pizza and Coca-Cola. And at some point in my life, I decided I didn't want to drink Coca-Cola anymore. So I started drinking other things. And eventually, now I just drink water, right? So it was like that replaced Coca-Cola for me. Now I just drink water. I never even think of Coca-Cola. It's not that the Coca-Cola link is completely gone, but it's been so underused that it's decayed over time. And if you imagine the Inside Out movie, they do that really beautifully with the train tracks. So if you haven't seen that, go see it. There's a scene where the teenager's train tracks are where her thoughts are delivered, and they begin to fall apart. And but that's the nature of the brain, is that it's constantly restructuring itself, and it's restructuring itself with this creative force, this spiritual energy, and then it's moving into creating a new track or a new network that then becomes more your norm. So it's really good to know that that's one of the things that you can do as a human being. You have choice. And one of the things I've seen happen in the Three Principles community is that as people learn about being connected to something larger than themselves, and as they begin to learn about thought and consciousness at work in their lives, they begin to drop thinking that isn't that helpful. It becomes less used and over time is replaced by thinking that's more helpful. So, for example, for me, I used to spend a lot of time in reaction, in upset, in anger. And over time, as my understanding deepened and as I saw the uselessness of that thinking and that feeling, I began to drop it just naturally. It didn't make sense to imagine somebody out there controlled something in here and I had to go out and change them to fix it. And as I imagined that, I began to experience more ease because it was just simple to drop those things that weren't true. And as I dropped those things that weren't true, my brain got on board, right? And began to develop areas that were more peaceful, more harmonious, made more sense. I hung out in more. And so literally we can, through understanding, we can understand something new and leave an old pathway behind and immediately begin constructing a new creation. So that's the potential for everything that we do. And that's the potential not only from a technique base, which is always the temptation, is to work in form, is to be like, okay, what's the technique for losing weight? What's the technique for, getting my paper right? What's the technique for A, B, and C? What I found is instead of technique, I have really developed more and more of this real estate in my brain that is calmer, more at peace, more curious, more open. I'll catch myself in reactivity and I'll say, is that true? And I'll look for that real estate and I'll invest there, because the natural result of that is to drop thinking like, I don't have time. I'm tired. I don't want to do that. It's hard. I don't have time. Nobody likes me. Whatever that kind of rumination, worry, fear, insecure thinking. The natural result is to drop it. And then from that peaceful, more relaxed state comes new creations. And they're different. The quality of them are different. And the feeling within which you live is different, even if you fail something, which I think is so important because we are human and we will fail things. So that's some of the stuff I wanted to share with you today. I'm not exactly sure how long this video is at this point, so I'm going to end it here and check. And then I would love for you to ask questions so that I can answer them, because I want to give you more than what you've gotten so far. And I want to let you know that I'm going to change the name of the podcast to Three Principles Podcast with this focus on neuroscience, because I've had one person sign up for neuroscience and really not understand why I would start with the first conversation, which was really about where are we looking from? And that's going to be an important part of this whole conversation the whole time we're working together. So as I do these videos, I'm going to get more clarity. And as I get more clarity and more insight, I'm going to go back in and make changes that we need to make. So thank you so much for your support. I deeply appreciate it. I am benefiting so much from having a little bit of extra, time and space to focus on school and to focus on my studies and to learn more. And I hope I'm able to give that back to you, give that right back to you. So thank you. Make a comment. Tell me what you think. Let me know what thoughts you have, what concerns, questions. Tell me your ideas, and we'll have a conversation. Bye, everybody.